Our last but not the least speaker is TD MacDonald, and his talk is Hide and Seek, Remote Sensing Technologies and Nuclear Stability.
Okay, so hello, my name is TD MacDonald. I'm a member of LNSP, which is the Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. We cover a pretty broad array of topics. We've got people working on simulation and experiments with radiation detectors, and we also have people all the way over working in social sciences side of things. So I'm sort of halfway in between. I'm working on the technical aspects of some policy questions. So I wanted to start off with this really heartwarming quote, because we're going to be talking about an arms race today. So it's maybe not the kind of arms race you think of when you hear the word. You probably are thinking of the massive buildup of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons over the course of the Cold War. What we're going to be talking about is a technological competition between hiders and seekers, between remote sensing technologies that are looking to find, detect, and track mobile nuclear missiles, and the technologies and strategies that are seeking to keep those hidden. So to motivate why we're going to be talking about this, we need to go through a quick example. This is going to be nuclear strategy in 2 minutes. So as you might imagine, all of the nuance is thrown out the window. We're just going to go through this at a very high level. So imagine you have two nuclear armed superpowers. So in this case, we have the breakaway province of New Brunswick and the Democratic People's Republic of Maine. So they both have nuclear weapons and they're at each other's throats. But they're both deterred from trying to take out the other guy, because if one side were to try to invade the other could then retaliate with their nuclear arsenal, or at least threaten to do so. And so by doing this, they're able to deter the aggression in the first place. And if both sides are vulnerable to nuclear retaliation from the other, then we say this is sort of a stable configuration, in that the incentives for both sides sort of point away from any sort of aggression. But people are generally not great about accepting vulnerability. So imagine you've got some crazy New Brunswicker who's like, you know what I'm gonna take my weapons, blow up their weapons, and then I can do whatever I want. So this is a strategy called counterforce. So it's the idea that you can attack an adversary's nuclear arsenal in order to degrade their ability to retaliate and give yourself some sort of freedom of action. But of course, in this example, Maine is not going to take this lying down. They're going to take some steps to try to give their arsenal some survivability to nuclear preemption. So they can do something like hardening, which is placing missiles in silos underground, making them hard to blow up. They can use concealment, which is making their weapons hard to find. If you don't know where they are, you have a hard time destroying them. So this would be something like a submarine. The other strategy would be redundancy. So either more weapons or just different platforms that you can use to make your arsenal harder to basically get all, but more resilient. So that would be, say, this mobile missile truck, which is called a TEL. So if Maine were to deploy all of these strategies, their arsenal will gain some modicum of survivability, and stability would be restored. But of course, this wouldn't be a great arms race if there weren't countermeasures to the countermeasures. So our crazy New Brunswicker comes back and says, yeah, so they're moving their missiles around, trying to make them hard to find, and I'm going to put a radar dish on a satellite and use that to find those missiles. So if I know where they are, I can blow them up. So this is the actual arms race we're going to be talking about today, because it's being discussed in the literature as the space-based radar satellites potentially undermining the survivability of ground-based mobile missiles, and that might be leading to some instability, because if New Brunswick thinks it can successfully disarm its opponent, it has an incentive to basically use its nuclear weapons and use the first strike incentive. Conversely, on the other side of things, Maine, if it knows its arsenal is vulnerable, it's going to be under some pressure to use their weapons before they lose them. So we're trying to avoid these unstable configurations. So we want to use a technical analysis of these two technologies to figure out, is this something we really need to be worried about? Should I be, going home and breaking around on a new bomb shelter in my backyard? So we're going to do this by basically looking at these technologies, trying to understand the science, and trying to understand how they interact with each other. So let's start with space-based radar. So radar imaging systems work by sending out a pulse of radio waves. It reflects off a target, bounces back to the receiver, and they measure some signal. This behaves according to what's called the radar equation. I've sort of excised the important bits up here. So you can think of the signal as how easy or how likely you are to be able to detect some target. That's going to be proportional to the power of your transmitter, the square of the area of your antenna, and the cross-section of the target. And for right now, let's just think of cross-section as sort of the size of the target. It's going to be also inversely proportional to the square of the wavelength. And I'll probably jump back and forth between wavelength and frequency. They're inversely proportional, so if it's inversely proportional to the square of the wavelength, that means it's proportional to the square of the frequency. And then it's also inversely proportional to the fourth power of the range, which means as something gets further away from you, the likelihood of you being able to detect it falls off very sharply. So if we want to recast this in our arms race mentality, we can put these variables sort of in the camp of the seeker. So the power, the area, and the wavelength. The seeker is trying to maximize the signal, so what they want is a large, powerful satellite that's operating at high frequencies, which is short wavelengths. On the flip side, if you're the hider, the things you can play with are the cross-section of your vehicle and to some degree the range, and I'll get to what I mean by that in the first place. So cross-section, I said, is sort of like size. It generally tracks with size, but it behaves maybe a little unintuitively because it depends very strongly on the angle at which you're viewing the object. So imagine you're in a big dark room, far away from the walls, far away from the floor somehow, and you're trying to see a mirror or mirrored surface using a flashlight. So if you shine your flashlight and you hit the mirror, if it's not pointed directly at you, the light from your flashlight is going to bounce off and away from you because you have, it's called specular reflection. The incident angle is going to be equal to the reflected angle, and that radiation is going to get away from you. But as soon as you're looking normal to your mirror, you're going to get this big flash of light back from your flashlight. And this is what we see with radar cross-section. Because radar cross-section, the sort of major component of radar cross-sections are these specular reflections. So you can imagine then, you could design an object with some amount of control over which angles it is most and least visible from. And so this is a strategy called shaping, and this is what gives the F-117 here its sort of distinctive shape. So this plane was worried about radars in front of it that it was flying towards seeing it, which is why it's got this kind of sloped back appearance. It's trying to deflect incoming radio waves sort of out into the sides and away from the receiver of that radar. If you wanted to apply this to something like a TEL, you could take an object, and so we're going to say this is going to be our stealth TEL. So this object is sort of sitting here at the origin. So as you change the tilt of the walls, you change basically the angle at which you're going to have your biggest specular flashes. And this is important because, as we mentioned before, the cross-section, the larger your cross-section, the larger the signal you're going to send back, so the further away you're going to be detectable. So if you're trying to design a stealthy TEL, you want to basically push these big specular flashes into areas where either the satellites are not going to be or where they're going to behave poorly, and you'd rather present the satellites with smaller cross-sections that are much harder to pick up. And specifically for TELs and space-based radar satellites, so the regions you want to look at for this would be straight up. If you can put your specular flash straight up, a satellite flying overhead is going to be directly above you for a very, very short period of time. And also way out low to the horizons, because that's going to require the satellites to be very, very far away, and there's a chance that there's going to be some sort of intervening obstacle that'll get in the way. The other method for managing radar cross-sections are radar absorbing materials. These do exactly what they're titled to do. They'll absorb incident radiation, dissipate some of its energy as heat, so it's not getting reflected back to the receiver, and these tend to work in a frequency-dependent manner. So this one, for example, operates most strongly sort of in the X band, around 10 to 12 gigahertz. So if you were the seeker and you knew your hider was using this, if you wanted to defeat it, you'd have two options. You could either try to increase the frequency that your satellite's operating at up to this region, but up here you start getting a lot of atmospheric attenuation and your performance generally drops off. Alternatively, you could go down to the lower frequencies where these materials don't work as well. But as we noted before, the signal that you get is inversely proportional to the wavelength. So as you go to these lower frequencies, which is longer wavelength, your ability to actually detect an object drops off pretty sharply. So this brings us back to our, our arms race, our standoff, whether we need to be worried that there is something inexorable about this competition that might lead us towards instability. So what can we say about this? We can't really say how this arms race is going to play out in practice because no amount of technical modeling lets you predict the future. But what we can do is make a couple of sort of broad statements. First is that space-based radar systems do have some capacity to detect and track mobile missiles, so the attention to this topic is definitely warranted. But we can also say that there are no sort of structural advantages in favor of the seeker that is necessarily going to make us worry that this is inevitably going to lead to some sort of stability, or instability, I should say. So today we were only really able to take a very sort of high level, very brief look at a very narrow slice of just the technical component of nuclear stability. But I hope what it did do is kind of illustrate how we can use our understanding of science and technology to help sort of guide which policies we should take, sort of promote smarter policies that'll work and avoid poor ones. Thanks.
Thank you very much, TD. Oh, one second.
Are you also going to be looking at the submarine problem? Do I have to talk about this?
Of the submarine component? I haven't looked at it yet. it's in the queue. So submarines are another thing that gets kind of brought up in the poli-sci literature as the oceans are becoming more transparent. I'm not entirely sure where that necessarily comes from because the sort of last indication of what was happening was during the Cold War. The US during the 70s was able to basically track every Soviet submarine the entire time it was out to sea using these really long-range sonar arrays. The Soviets eventually made their subs quiet enough that you could no longer pick these things up from long distance. It really kind of cut off the ability of the US to track these things. So nowadays, the sort of best sonar sensors are ones that you sort of set up as pickets. They can look straight up, and they've got very good signal noise. So anything that passes over, even if it's a very quiet sub, you'll detect. But it's a pretty far cry from the sort of ocean-wide surveillance that used to occur. So that's going to be sort of the next half of the project, but haven't delved too deep into the technical stuff yet.
So this whole theory seems sort of based on these big, expensive, monolithic things. So a big satellite capable of imaging a ground-based system. So how does this whole picture and your approach to it change when the tools to do these things become very cheap and highly distributable? So land or sea-based drones, or computer network transparency through hacking, or other things which are just very, very cheap to deploy and don't necessarily require state actors maybe, or sort of pseudo-associated state actors. How does this picture change and how do you approach that?
Yeah, so well, generally speaking, if you have a non-state actor, the reasons for caring about, say, where Russia's ground-based mobile missiles are, probably few and far between. They might be more looking to try to hijack something. Yeah, so especially, well, looking at the sort of the radar thing in general, there's another thing that's sort of on the horizon of using sort of swarms of smaller satellites instead of these giant 100-square-meter arrays, and you can get sort of what's called high-resolution wide swath imaging with them. The thing is, what I didn't really get a chance to talk about in the talk is that the trucks, they're not trying to, say, eliminate their radar cross-section entirely. They're just trying to blend in with the background. So they need to just get their signal such that it looks like the signal you'd expect off a logging truck or something like that. So it becomes an issue of discrimination at that point. And no matter how many sensors you might have, if the signal's not there in the first place, it's very hard to dig it out. In terms of things like small optical drones, yeah, who knows? But those are also things that typically work on a pretty short range. So if you imagine these trucks wandering around down in the forests of the middle of Russia or up in the highlands in China, a lot of those things where you're saying, oh, but yeah, what if we had a drone that was flying around in there and it was stealthy? Well, you're violating their airspace. You're almost like taking that first step to war to do something that's you would ideally want to be doing in a very benign way, sort of in the background. So there's a lot of escalation implied in getting these things there in the first place. So I think Dick has.
Your comment about the radar cross-section, isn't it sort of the case you'd really like to make the truck equivalent of an F-117? I mean, this thing, obviously has not been thought out to put anti-reflection and absorbers on it, but
No.
is that, I mean, that sounds to me like that would be a cheaper approach than, it's just, how many of them do they have? You're just gonna put something on top of it. So it
Yeah.
doesn't show in the radar image.
Yeah. So if you were to put just like a conducting cabinet, so this is obviously not what an actual one would look like, but just a metal box around it, that gives you sort of the ability to control. And this is you could imagine something like that would be very cheap relative to, say, fielding a new constellation of satellites. So there is sort of this cost benefit to the hider in that case.
Also, there's the other possibility, which is that the trucks have are active in their reflection. They retransmit.
Yeah, so there's, back in early mid-2000s, the US was thinking of deploying this big constellation of space-based radar satellites for this mapping, synthetic aperture radar mapping. And around the same time as that was announced, there's actually a very large uptick in papers out of China about spoofing SAR satellites. So the issue with active imaging systems like a radar is they always see you before you see them because you're sending out pulses, and there's the R4, it's only R squared on the way there. So what they were looking at doing is measuring incoming pulses, doing some very quick calculations, and then sending back a spoofed reflection that you would expect to see if, say, this object was over here. Or really they were trying to actually like cover wide areas, say this river isn't here, it's just a piece of land. So they're not, they are spoofable.
Good. So thank you very much again, and thanks to all of our. Thank you very much for listening. We are not done yet. So, as you have explored, we had a number of really interesting and high-quality posters and poster presentations by our students. So, every year they give us harder time to choose which one should be acknowledged as the best poster, right? So, then it turns out every year we end up choosing more of them because we cannot decide on one. All right, so I'll announce 3 of them that we have decided to acknowledge this time. And first one by no order, just the last one I have a picture of, I guess, is by Jason Vavrek, Isotope Sensitive Verification of Nuclear Warheads. Okay. So next is Mooney Zhu, Understanding the Generation and Evolution of Cosmic Magnetic Fields. Is she here? And the last one is Carolyn Coyle, Improving Understanding of Radiative Heat Transfer in High Temperature Liquid Salts. Okay. Congratulations to all of you, and thank you very much again for both to you and to all the poster presenters that we really had an interesting and enjoyable session, and keep up your good work. Okay? Good.